Hi, you're listening to the NewSpace India podcast, a bi weekly talk show that exclusively brings insights from the Indian space activities ecosystem. I'm your host, Narayan, the co founder of India's first space focused think tank, Spaceport Sarabhai. Guests on the NewSpace India podcast help you understand space activities related macro and micro trends within India in all aspects, including space history, local industry, space science, technology evolution, law and policy, art, and more. The NewSpace India podcast is supported by Dassault Systems, a global leader in providing businesses and people with collaborative virtual environments to enable sustainable innovations. Dassault Systems Solutions supports startups, small and medium-scale enterprises, and original equipment manufacturers in developing disruptive solutions for space launchers and satellites. Hi, and welcome to yet another episode of the NewSpace India podcast. Today we have here Gunjan, who is one of the co-founders of Tathya Earth, startup that is based out of Mumbai. So Gunjan, thank you so much for taking the time and recording this episode with me, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Narayan. Thank you for having me here.
So let's begin with a little bit of the origin story of your founding team itself. You guys have a very interesting background, and the way you've stepped into the geospatial applications domain, it's very interesting to see non-space people always come into the space sector. So I would say, for the benefit of the audience, it would be very interesting to know what you guys' background are and how you came across this domain of geospatial analytics and insights, and how that led to then.
Okay. So we have to go pretty back then. Let me introduce the founding team and our background a little bit. And I think from A to Z and how it led to the genesis of the idea and the company. So myself and Naresh, we are the technical folks in our team. So our background is predominantly in analytics, data science, and machine learning, and software engineering. And Nikit and Himanshu, they look after the sales and business development side of the business at this point of time. Now, with regards to how we look at our space, we don't think of ourselves as a space tech or space related startup as such. We are in the commodities business. We provide insights on the supply chain of commodities. So I think a closer description would be, we are an analytics company wherein we provide real-time intelligence on supply chain of commodities. Satellite images happen to be one of the good sources of data that we use for our insights. And this combined with other data sources like shipping data or bill of ladings, etc., combined, they form a good data sources for us on which we run our algorithms to provide intelligence on the supply chain of commodities. So this is how we look at how we describe ourselves. Now, coming to how the genesis of the idea was formed. Now, being from a analytics background, so I was working with a company called Money Control. I was leading their data science and analytics team. And at Money Control, we used to work with a lot of economic data. And I think one of the constant discussion points with our research team was that most of the economic data, they used to come with a lot of lag. And in some countries or certain economies, the data was not even correct. And it used to be revised multiple times. And at that point of time itself, there's a lot of explosion in terms of new and alternative data sources, and satellite data being one of them. So it triggered my mind whether we can look at this other alternative data sources to study different types of economic activities that are happening on the ground, and then predict or measure those economic indicators which are at this point of time derived through human survey or published by the companies themselves or industries themselves. When we were looking at that, we saw a lot of examples where researchers were working on satellite images to look at poverty levels in sub-Saharan African areas, to look at how the policy decisions of World Bank were impacting. So I think that is the first time where we came across satellite data and its application. And then I really thought, if we could look at every point of the earth every day, it could lead to a lot of other applications. And in our case, we knew from our experience, when it comes to economic data or economic information, there were some gaps in the type of data that we were getting. And that is where we started our journey to looking at satellite data and measuring different kind of economic activities. So when I say economic activities, now again, that's a very huge space. So when we had to make business sense, or we started speaking to more people, and then soon realized we have to focus on one particular industry or one particular genre. And then we started focusing on the metal and mining industry, and in particular on commodities. So at this point of time, we monitor supply chain of commodities like steel, iron, coal, copper, aluminum, etc., and cater to industries, be it metal producers, physical traders, financial institutes all around the world. And the core still remains the same, which is to monitor in near real time supply chain of different kinds of commodities. Yeah. So that is basically how we came to form the company, and got into using satellite data.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And obviously, I think there's a lot of space for people like you who realize that there's a lot of power in using satellite to help other industries and stepping into the space tech from a SaaS oriented business model to come into the sector to create a lot of value. That is definitely a lot of presence in there. So from the time that stepped away from money control, and maybe your colleagues as well from their own journeys starting, what is the approach that you probably took to validate the idea? Because obviously sitting out of India, I think the space that you are in with all this economic tracking and so on, the end users may often also not be as mature in India as other countries, because I guess even in the metals and minerals industry, there's a lot of players in US, in Singapore, and many other countries. So the customer base for you, like many other companies as well, maybe 95% of the market is outside of India to a large extent. So how do you deal with assessing product market fit and doing a lot of customer discovery, the early stages, like sitting out of India? And is that a very big challenge?
Yeah. So the way we went about doing customer discovery at the beginning was, I think we reached out to a lot of people from via LinkedIn or other sources who are connects, common friends. And you are right, most of them are not in India. So for our industry, we started off with ferrous steel supply chain. And majority of the trading fraternity, mining companies, all their headquarters are in Singapore. Most of their headquarters are in Singapore. And when we started off, it was just the beginning of the pandemic. So around 2020 beginning. And by April, obviously everything shut down. I think in the beginning, in 2020, it helped us a little, because what has happened was most people had some downtime. They were opening to discussing new ideas. As I said, we use multiple channels, right? We cold email, cold call, we cold messaged them on LinkedIn. Through our advisors, we connected with people. So I think the primary focus of the first year of our business was to do things correctly. First was to talk to as many users as possible and to validate the problem statement. And second was to build out of all the products possible that we could build one product which would be the most impactful for the industry. So we talked to many companies, right? Starting small, large, and tried to gauge the interest levels to the type of products that we thought would be interesting to them. Now, even when you do that, there's difference between, say, just asking. So if you can ask whether this will be useful to you, whether you will buy it. So sometimes the answers could be very positive, but when it actually comes to buying and paying, that is when you know where the real worth of the data or product is. We got a lot of positives. So it was only around 2021 when we started actually beta testing the data with our customers. And initially itself, I think some of the large publication houses like IHS Markets, they picked up our data, they validated our information, they published it in their reports, and which created a lot of buzz or credibility for us at the initial stages. And from there we got picked up by other very reputed publications, and they published our data. So that sort of created a credibility for the information or data that we are publishing. And from our discussions that we had started around 2020 beginning onwards, we knew what kind of clients that we should go after. So mid of 2021 is when we started selling subscriptions or providing subscriptions of our data to our clients. And so the journey has been good from there. So this year we have been able to partner with some of the large 1400 companies also. Most of them based out of Singapore, some of them based out of London, and some in Singapore, some in Switzerland. Yeah, so the journey has been long, but I think the learning curve has also been steep in our case, because that industry itself is not very matured in India. So it was a lot of reaching out to people. And you're right, being present in the same geography as our clients is very important. Last year was the first time that we actually went out after all the lockdowns got over. So we visited Singapore. We met all of our clients. So all of our clients are basically in the same 500 square meter, it's in a small vicinity. All of them are located. So it creates a very different kind of vibe. You get to know him, and the sales process is very different. I think when we can meet your clients face to face rather than doing it only on a Zoom call or a Teams call. So that creates a difference. And because of that, I think next year onwards, we also want to have a permanent presence in Singapore, so that we can meet our clients more often face to face. And so that creates a lot of difference actually in the sales cycle.
And so, what would be very interesting to know is what kind of impact you believe that you are creating for your customers. Because always, I think, in any of these kinds of interesting business models around decision intelligence, insights about an industry,
Yeah.
it all comes down to value capture, then depends on the return on investment that a lot of the enterprises are making on such tools, right? So have you guys done any kind of analysis on, before you guys providing them these kind of data and these kinds of intelligence, that their business was affecting X, and now because of this you are able to prove to them that you're creating an impact that is X, that is Y, and that's how you're able to then build a business case around it?
No, in a product like ours, where we provide intelligence, it's very difficult to assign a specific numbers, but I can give anecdotes or examples to prove or to say how that we are creating value for our customers. What happens is basically we provide sets of information, right? And the company or the client combines it with other information sources to make decisions. Now, that is dependent on a number of factors. It depends on what the kind of information that we are giving. It depends on the person and the analyst who is making that call. And it also depends what kind of other information they have. So combined all together, they make a call to say, they make a business decision. Now, two anecdotes of whether we have been able to provide positive impact on the business. Say there are a couple of examples, right? There are customers, large customers, who, when we started off, say beginning of this year, they started off with very small packages. Let me monitor only India, or let me monitor only Southeast Asia. So they did that for around 7, 8 months. So the amount of value they saw, then they came back and said, no, now I want to monitor the entire world. Give me data for China, give me data for Australia, give me data for Europe. So that created that flywheel or the initial trust. This data is useful. They're able to make business calls. They're able to make profits. I have entered into multi-year contracts now from the initial results. And it's not just one client. It has happened with 2 other clients, where from the initial results, they have been able to create enough confidence. They have been able to show enough ROI to their business stakeholders so that they can take a much larger package in the subsequent years. So those are some of the examples that we see where I think it proves that we have been able to create impact, but it's still difficult, I think, at this point of time to quantify how much that impact would be. And that depends on a number of factors for the industry.
Yeah, I can definitely understand your perspective on that. And obviously, that's always a challenge to look at it as a whole in terms of the impact. From a standpoint of data availability and the sources and all of the sources that you would want to use to build your data sets to be able to drive these things. Obviously, you mentioned about how the demand for your services has been increasing as people adopt this, and the geographical area of interest is increasing, and the kind of customers are also diversifying. What is your review of existing sources in the industry, and are they sufficient? And it'll be very interesting to know if you see a market for absorbing commercial data in different bands or different sources as well. Because one of the main themes of a lot of the Earth observation systems, commercial ones, new space ones, have been around is that they are going to empower people like you to make better services. Is the price? What will be also interesting to know is your thesis around free data and commercial data. And in commercial data, how easy is it to absorb their prices and if their performance is good? And any insights around it would be really nice to hear.
Yeah, that's a very good question actually. And this is the thing that we struggle with always with regards to commercial images versus free images and the value they provide, the ROI they will provide, and the cost that one has to incur in buying. So in our case specifically, we use a combination of free from space agency NASA and commercial satellites from be it Maxar or Planet Labs. Now, say we struggle is with say information like from some of the commercial satellite providers or stereo images or thermal data, which is just coming online from companies like Satellite View or Albedo. Now, it becomes very difficult in a commercial for people like us, where say the number of clients may be lesser. And if the product price of, if I have to pay for one image $600-$700, right? And for a product like ours, it's a weekly monitoring of an asset. So you can imagine the price of the end product that it's going to be incurred only in buying the commercial images. And there are very few companies in the world at this point of time who would be able to who would be willing to incur the entire cost upfront without knowing the ROI. And the ROI only becomes very apparent, say, after a year of using it, when they have been able to consistently use it to make business decisions. Say after a year's time, they will be able to decide what is the ROI. So that becomes a very big hurdle in terms of adoption of new data sources or commercial data sources. And this is something that we are struggling to figure out. How do we use it in the initial phase? Who will be funding it? So should we fund it? Should it be funded between clients and us? Should it be divided into multiple clients? So if there's only one taker for one product, it's just very difficult to make it. If there are multiple takers for the same product, maybe it becomes more economically viable. Those are the kind of things. There are certain products which everyone needs that we are building, for which we use commercial satellites, because we can divide the cost and other people can use it. So each client need not pay a lot of dollars. But if there's some new product which, say there are a few customers at the beginning, how do we create the initial trust and take it to market? So the go-to market becomes very difficult when it comes to expensive commercial satellites actually. And I think for that, some type of partnerships with satellite companies could also help, which is not happening at this point of time.
Yeah, I think it's a very important topic for the years to come actually, because although people have been trying to reduce the cost of imagery for the last 10 years, they've still not got there.
Yeah. And it's just too high for if you have to buy, say, one image a month, that's also is fine for us. But if there are hundreds of assets that we monitor and every week that we monitor, that's when the cost becomes very high if you use expensive commercials.
So from a standpoint of also, apart from the sources, it's also about cloud and the nature of the cloud that you want to use. How is that evolving for companies like you? Because obviously today there's Google and Amazon and Microsoft who are primarily like fighting out in that space. And they're also, a lot of them are also now focused on space as a vertical.
Right.
So is this something that advantageous to you with the costs? Are the costs on the cloud for computing decreasing, or are they increasing, or how is that impacting the business? Because obviously that is the second bit of the cost and the human resource cost.
Yeah, so cloud cost is a very important line item in our expense. So as you rightly mentioned, there are multiple cloud providers, and currently we are working with AWS, and they have a lot of focus on I think space data or space startups. So we have been lucky at this point of time to have enough credits which have been able using which we have been able to keep our costs down. But I think the cost itself is coming down with time, but still is significantly higher for any startup like ours. But with a lot of programs which gives credits, we have been able to utilize that. And at this point of time, our cloud cost in terms of actual dollars paid is quite negligible, thanks to multiple programs.
And from a standpoint of the geospatial community within India, what do you see, or how mature do you believe? Because I think you might have, through the couple of years that you've been around now, building this product, obviously I think you might have seen other companies or been to other geospatial events. How mature do you think is the geospatial ecosystem in India? And are we at the very early stages where there's far too little companies, or is there some level of maturity in terms of building these kinds of SaaS? Because I think India has been a very big outsourcing hub for geospatial, where
Yeah.
large companies have been outsourcing a lot of work. There's a lot of
Yeah.
type of business models being present. A lot of companies that provide individual outsourcing support or rectification and these kinds of very basic changes that you can do on satellite imagery to prepare that to be absorbed. Those kinds of services have been around for a lot of time, annotation and things like that. But in terms of actually building full value SaaS businesses using geospatial,
Uh-huh.
that is something that I don't see as much as the others. So what is your kind of assessment?
I think it's maturing, is starting. I think the major challenge is not satellite data. I think the major challenge to that is knowing the industry where we have to deploy or use, say, space data. So let's see, and I completely understand your point, going where India was primarily, outsourcing hub earlier, where a lot of geospatial analytics used to be done, working on data sets or providing analytics on data. So what we are talking about now is converting all those data sets into products, which can be or a SaaS platform or a SaaS offering which client can use. So I think if you look at geospatial data, now there are certain industries where geospatial data becomes more useful or more handy. I think it's mostly industries where it's asset heavy, heavily distributed systems, so heavy distributed supply and distributed assets everywhere, which has to be managed. So oil and gas, agriculture, metal and mining, defense, shipping, all these sectors I think are the prime candidates for applying satellite data. Now, I think as far as I am concerned, I think I can for some other people also whom I know. So our exposure to those industries growing up while doing our engineering or while doing our schools, our exposure to those industries less. So our exposure to, say, metal and mining industry, to commodities industry, to shipping, to defense, the typical engineer would not be, I think, exposed to such industries. I think, and once we get exposed to, I think that once we get exposed to those important industries or other industries where geospatial data can be applied or can be used as one of the inputs, only then I think you will see more offerings for those players or for those industries where geospatial data can actually add value. So I think just to summarize, I think it is exposure to the industries where geospatial data can be used and add value, which is more important for us. And it's not a technical challenge. I think it is more to do with exposure to the industries itself. So I was not aware of metal and mining commodities where I'm working as of now, to say 5 years back. So that's how drastic our learning curve has been. And it's very fascinating, right? So all these industries, traditional industries, they drive our economy. They're the most important parts of our economy, which everything else is dependent on. And most of us are not exposed to those sectors. I think exposure to such industries are the key, where we can leverage satellite data, other satellite data, geospatial techniques to drive value. Yeah, that's my thought on that.
And from your company's perspective, what is the barrier to entry in terms of cost? Or is it because at the end of the day, upstream in space is extremely difficult to build rockets and satellites? You need tens of millions of dollars, and it's not very easy to enter that space. And there's some companies that have managed to do that in India, and obviously that is a very big barrier to enter, given the investment landscape as well. But for anybody who wants to look at a geospatial business or so, what is the baseline foundation based on which they can really start up? Is it because cloud gives you credits? There's a lot of free imagery that is out there. From your experience, what is the kind of investment that a typical, let's say, a very bright Indian kid who wants to start a space or a geospatial company, how much of an effort it has to go in terms of capital and resources?
I think it's less to do with capital, more to do with understanding the business statement. So I think what has to be crystal clear is which industry one has to target and which particular problem statement one can target to, which can be solved with geospatial data. And one has to always remember geospatial data is one of the important inputs. There are many other inputs that goes into the final solution, which makes it usable for the end customer, right? So one has to be cognizant of that fact. So one has to study very well, identify those pain points, and then design a system which can use multiple data sets, including geospatial data, which can solve for that problem statement. And for that it's not mostly a function of money, it's mostly a function of domain understanding. So one has to understand the domain and problem solving abilities. The other systems, like the other things like working with satellite data, working on cloud, all these things a bright engineer can figure out. Our satellite data is nothing but another raster data. It's just that the number of layers is higher. We can interpret the layers differently, but at the end of the day, we should treat it as a input, and it's a means to an end, which is to solve a business statement or a business problem. Clients don't care whether it comes from satellite data or it comes from any other sources. For example, in our case, the problem statement that we solve for is that high frequency data and coverage anywhere on the earth. For that particular use case, geospatial data is unique in its capability that we can use geospatial data to solve that particular problem statement. So knowing those problem statements, I think, is the biggest barrier to entry, and knowing what else is required to solve it along with geospatial data is something that is required to build a final product which can be used by a client.
And how big is the market for Tathya, and how do you see yourself evolving into a company? How large can the company get in the next, let's say, 5 to 7 years time frame?
Yeah.
What is your sense of growth here?
We are focused at this point of time, we are focused on the metal commodity sector, right? So metal commodity means steel, aluminum, copper, nickel, etc. And our goal is to provide real-time supply chain intelligence for all these commodities. Now, there are three aspects of the supply chain that we monitor. First is to map in real time or near real time supply demand indicators. Number two is to monitor sustainability or environmental impacts of this supply chain. Number three is to monitor climate risk to the supply chain. So anything that can impact or is affected by the supply chains, that is what we are going to monitor in the next, say, 4 to 5 years. And that itself is a very big market. The kind of industries that we go after, or the kind of industries that we cater to, are so they're basically all the stakeholders to the commodities. So these are physical traders, financial institutes, metal producers, mining companies, and then downstream companies. Downstream companies means any company which buys commodities for their end product. So even they are impacted by the fluctuations in the commodity prices, and the fluctuations in the commodity prices is basically understood if we can monitor the supply chains well. So the final goal for us is to monitor prices, is to predict prices of these commodities, which that can be used by the different stakeholders to make appropriate business decisions. So as you can see, these are different industries that we are catering to, which is a very large market. So in our case, I think the serviceable market that we had calculated would be around 5 to 10 billion, and that does not even consider the sustainability part, because that is a very growing industry. There's a lot of unknowns, but I'm sure with the type of conversation that we are having with different participants of the supply chain, that even the sustainability or the climate part is going to be a big aspect of the commodity supply chain. There are clients who ask us, if you can monitor, say, floods around the coal mines in Australia, or what is the impact of a storm in the iron ore mines in Brazil? What has been the impact in the ports around Canada or US? So all these kind of factors also, if we build in, so it becomes, if you can imagine, it becomes a holistic supply chain monitoring platform, which has supply chain intelligence, climate intelligence, and the impact on the environment. So all these factors taken together, it becomes a large enough market size for us, exciting market space for us to go after. Now, at the end of the day, if you can see, whatever we are building is an asset monitoring platform, right? So if we look at plainly or as an asset monitoring platform, so we can extend or use this platform across different other adjacent industries also. So oil and gas industry, agriculture, railways, utilities, all of them become lucrative industries where we can extend up. At the end of the day, we believe we can build a multi-billion-dollar company in this space, and I think solving for important problem statements for some of the most important industries that we have in our world. And yeah, we are very excited about the future of this.
And the two other aspects that would be very interesting to know from you in your experience is really, one, the investment angle, the appetite for people in India, Indian investors essentially, to understand your kind of business. Because often I think there's a lot of people who, I guess, fairly have a very good understanding of e-commerce and other things where it's much more mature, and but understanding your kind of businesses where it's a SaaS platform and they need to understand either the industry or the technology or the service. Is there enough understanding to raise enough capital at different stages? Maybe you find good investors at the seed stage or so on. So what is the appetite for understanding your kind of business at various stages of investment? The second aspect to this is really what is the maturity of the human resources in terms of ability to recruit? Is there a lot of time that you need to spend training people to get them up to speed, or invest a lot in them to when them be productive for the product itself? So what are your experience around this?
Okay, so let me take the first question first around investment and appetite for investors in a sector like ours. So we operate in the commodity sector, right? Aside the data sets that we or technology that we use, the commodities market itself is not a very lucrative market in India. And as I had mentioned earlier, also I think even as I was also not exposed to the industry, most of the VCs or investors are also not exposed to the industry. So most people would not have any thesis centered monitoring supply chains of commodities. No, they understand the commodities market in depth, right? So that's an issue in India, and hence the kind of capital that a company like ours in the commodity sector would be exposed to would be on the lower side. So it's very limited. Now, but to counter that point, again, the industry, the same commodities industry is very mature in the Western economies. We will be trying to fundraise in Singapore and US. So in Singapore, this is a bread and butter industry, right? Students are exposed to the industry from universities itself. There are special commodity courses, shipping courses. So people are exposed to this industry, and there are investors who have the thesis around shipping, commodities, working on industrial sectors, who, in my opinion, would be the correct sources for capital for a company like us. And we are talking to a few of them. Hopefully sometime in the first quarter of next year, we'll be able to have more traction on that. Yeah. So to your question, yeah, India probably is not the right place to fundraise for a company like ours. But again, there are certain investors now who look at companies like ours from a sustainability angle, because we also have angle where we look at the sustainability side of the supply chain. Those are the thesis driven investors that we can speak to and who have been receptive to the product or a concept that we are working on. But the kind of understanding and reception or feedback that we get from investors in Singapore and US is very different. So they have been far more receptive to a product like ours, and they seem to know more about the industry and seem more willing to invest in an industry like us. So that is to do with investment. Now, second, in terms of human capital or recruiting engineers to work on product like us, yeah, compared to say a full stack engineer, compared to a regular data science, of course, it is more difficult, but there are fantastic, I think, universities programs from where we have been able to recruit. So I think a special shout out should go to the IIT Bombay's program, Tech program, Master's program. Their CSI department is really good. We have been able to collaborate with them, hire people from there, then own test institutes where they have trained people in remote science. Then we have also been able to train people who have a background in data science or software engineering to work on satellite images. So the training part does take some time. Say for a relatively smart individual, probably it will take around a month or two to understand the nuances of satellite imagery and learn about that, and then start applying all the concepts. Yeah, so these are some of the resources that we are leveraging at this point of time. And I think, and the hiring has been, I would say we have been fortunate that we have been able to work with I would say smart people who have a fast learning curve and who have been able to ingest or understand new types of data sets. Be it, we started with optical, we went to SAR, we went to then thermal. So it's a fast learning curve for everyone. So I think the key is to work with smart people who can learn fast and adapt to different kinds of situations, different kinds of data. So yeah, that's the key, I think. And right. India having a large pool of engineers, I think there's a huge potential to work on geospatial data.
Right. One of the things that I am currently discussing with a large corporate house is to potentially put up a geospatial accelerator in India. I don't see any prominent geospatial technology based programs that are dedicated, because there's some commonalities there where cloud is a commonality, satellite imagery is a commonality. There may be different sources of data that are common to a large extent. So a lot of the foundational pieces that are needed can serve to a lot of interesting new companies to be formed. And based on that, there could be also exposure or a community that is built towards end users who can act as mentors to find product market fit, experts in infrastructure or mining or other areas, right? I see that this is something that many of the other countries do have. UK has this, the US has some of this as well, and there's a lot of other countries, but nothing really in India that I see for all of this. Do you think it's an interesting thing to have in the country? And if there's, what would be your suggestions around?
I think it's very interesting. I think the prime example of how ESA works or European Space Agency works at different companies, right? So I think what's required in the ecosystem is our first of all, clients or companies would be able to adopt the solutions. So first deciding what kind of solutions have to be built, for whom it has to be built, and who has to build them. For example, Visa, they work with different industries, have problem statements. Then they work with startups, give grants for them to solve for their problem statement using, say, ESS data in combination of multiple data sources. So it solves the problem of capital, the initial capital, the problem statement for us to solve for, and I think the human capital we always have. So I think what has to be onboarded first is our industries who would open up their problem statements, which can be solved using geospatial data. And then the second step would be to see who would be willing to fund that through via grants. And I think from there, I'm sure we'll be able to find some startups or engineers who will be able to take up those problem statements. I think those are the models I think we can look at, and it has proved to be successful in other countries. I don't see any reason it can't be successful here. And I think not only Indians, I think we can look at any customers around the globe who would be willing to provide their problem statement. And I think one of the core advantages that we in India have as a SaaS business or an outsourcing business is our inherent cost structures are very low. What costs to build a product in, say, Paris would cost 1/5 of that in India for the same quality. Everything remains the same, right? And I think that's very big advantage that we should take advantage. We should use that advantage to basically build up scalable businesses. So I think those are the key points that we have to keep in mind when building up an accelerator like that or a setup like that.
Gunjan, final question. What are you looking for yourself for Tathya? And is it investors? Is it people? So what is the horizon like? So if somebody is listening in to this podcast and they can reach out for something or the other, what would it be?
We are always looking for clients and capital. And I think if you have that, the talent pool, the engineering pool, we can hire.
Great. So you guys are doing a terrific job with trying to build this out and roll this out
Thank you.
As a global enterprise. So terrific work around this, and congrats on all the progress that you guys have done. And please send my regards to your colleagues.
Sure, I'll do. Yeah.
As well. So I hope to meet you guys in person at some point of time.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. When next time you're in India, we should meet up.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time in recording this with me. And I'll leave the links for you guys, the website and LinkedIn profiles in the show notes for anybody to then reach out to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening in to this episode of the NewSpace India podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share this episode with anyone you believe will enjoy listening to it. You'll be able to find the NewSpace India podcast in any of the podcasting platforms that you may be using, including Apple, Google, Spotify, YouTube, and others. Do subscribe to the podcast in case you want to receive new episodes automatically. I'm grateful if you're able to leave a rating for the podcast, which will help others discover it. Thank you for listening in again, and the next episode will be out in the next 2 weeks as usual.